So starting off with the first tower here, the turret. The turret is the best at mid to late game. Level 3 turret spam absolutely annihilates mid game, and max level is also really useful in stuff like hardcore. Its weakness, early game, obviously. Expensive as heck tower, look at this. Commander, it's best at, of course, buffing towers. Fire rate buff. Its weakness, doing damage. That is literally as straightforward as it gets. Commando. Its strength is also around mid-game because it is kind of expensive, but it doesn't exactly have too much DPS to be carried on to late game for it to be considered best at mid to late game, and its worst, obviously, hidden enemies. Cowboy. It's the best at making money for any tower that is not a farm. And as for its worst trait, that would have to be late game. Normal Cowboy just isn't that strong late game. Crook Boss, he's the best at early mid game. Late game is where he loses DPS and also where he's the worst at. DJ Booth is amazing for giving towers range and making them cheaper, meaning it's the best during mid to late game. That obviously implies that its worst trait is its early game abilities, because the 10% range buff that you're getting it at the start for, it's just not going to be that helpful. Demoman. It's the best at taking out very clustered hordes, of course, if you spam the Demoman. And its worst trait is single target damage. Engineer. The best part about it is that it's a very balanced tower. It's good through the entire game, so its only worst trait would have to be hidden detection. Can't really do that much damage to hiddens. Farm. The only thing it literally does is give you money, so that's obviously the thing it's best at. And the worst time to have the farm would be wave 40, so I guess the worst part about it would be it taking up your placement space. Freezer. Surprisingly, it does have a best part about it, and that is it being able to cluster up enemies for AoE towers like Demoman earlier here, or future towers like Mortar to be able to do more damage. The worst part is that any enemy that is stronger than like a giant boss is practically going to be unaffected by the freezer, let alone of course bosses. Gladiator. It's obviously the best for speedrunning, that's its best part. And its worst trait is going to have to be bosses, it just doesn't have that much range, but it can still squeeze out a good amount of damage. Next up is Hunter. His best part is probably early mid game, and especially events. During like nights 1, 2, 3, and all of that, Hunter was actually a pretty useful tower. The worst part about it is late game DPS. It just kind of falls off. Militant. The best part about the Militant is that it's like the Engineer, useful throughout the entire game, really good during early game, and could still deal a massive amount of damage late game. Medic. Obviously the best for its ability, it could just heal all of your stun towers, making it an absolute must-have in hardcore, and early game is the medic's worst trait. It just doesn't do that much damage and it's kind of expensive, you usually won't even need the healing. Military base is best early through mid game. It's not that great late game because there's only a placement limit of 5, although it's very strong, it's still kind of expensive. And the worst part about it is obviously the spawn times. You sometimes get it when you want it, sometimes not, and that could really screw over your run. Minigunner, and just like the Engineer and the military base before this, it's really useful throughout the entire game. You could get it pretty early on, and you could spam a bunch of max level ones late game. It is actually kind of difficult to come up with a worst part to the Minigunner, because if used properly, there really isn't that many big downsides that you can see to the Minigunner. But I'd say how easily it gets stunned is probably the biggest concern you'd have when using the Minigunner. Mortar, it's the best for taking out very clustered enemies, but simultaneously, it's the worst at dealing actually good damage to enemies that aren't clustered in more than groups of 5. Ranger. Although it got nerfed, the best part about it is still how good it is against bosses, because it doesn't get stunned. The worst part about it, undoubtedly, hidden detection. I mean, it's been talked about a lot, just Outlaw having its hidden detection removed kind of just left us with this. Paintballer. It's actually surprisingly strong in the early game because it has a good explosion radius, and that's kind of its strength. The worst part about it is that you can't really sustain it for long. It's only good for early game, because after that, the Paintballer pretty much becomes useless. It doesn't have hidden detection, and its damage is also pretty trash. Pyromancer. The best part about it is its early game performance. It can absolutely wipe out hordes, but as soon as we get later into the game, it kind of becomes disappointing because it does very little damage and just speeds up enemies, although the speed up is very small, so it's not too much of a compromise. Rocketeer. It's gotta be one of the towers that's literally not the best at anything, and that implies that it's the worst at literally everything. It fires too slowly to be good for early game, does too little damage to be good for mid and late game, so yeah, it's just a trash tower. Scout, its best performance is speedrunning. Because it doesn't have that much damage, but it's also cheap, it makes it really quick for the earliest waves. And the worst part of the Scout has to be its late game performance, it just isn't strong late game. Shotgunner, it's clearly the best for speedrunning. If you don't have the Gladiator, this is the way to go. The worst part about it though is obviously bosses. It doesn't have that great single target damage. Because of its range, bosses would get out of it pretty quickly, so yeah. Sniper is at best at early through mid game. If you upgrade it, you can actually get decent DPS from it, and it's the worst for late game. Its DPS just is too low by then. Soldier, also best for early game. It's usually able to kill off the early waves and can actually do really good damage into mid game as well. As for the worst counterpart of it, it's obviously its late game performance. Just doesn't have that much DPS in the end. Ace Pilot, it's an amazing tower all around throughout the entire game, and the best part about it really has to be its cost efficiency. It's really cheap for the amount of damage that it's giving you. The worst part about it is its movement. Because it spins in a circle, sometimes it'll just miss the enemies that you want it to hit, and right after that, another flying tower, the Pursuit. It's probably best for hordes like Mystery Boss spam, for example. The amount of missiles it rains down, and the amount of damage it does is really good for those hordes. However, the worst part about it is, of course, its targeting. Probably has the most garbage targeting in the game. It willingly lets enemies run by it, which makes it really annoying to use. And the fact that it got nerfed, I can say with 100% certainty, at least in my opinion, that the targeting has to be the worst downside of this Pursuit. Electroshocker, it's best at electroshocking. This would have to be mid-game, because late-game enemies aren't exactly affected by it that much, but unlike what I just said about late-game, early game is actually where this guy is worst at, because he does like no damage and he stuns only like one enemy, and even then for barely any time. Toxic Gunner, he's great during mid game because he has good DPS for his price, and it's able to slow down pretty much all the enemies you'll encounter in mid game. His weakness, definitely late game. He just isn't able to slow down big enemies and bosses, so just kind of makes him worthless then. Sledger, it's best used for speedrunning. It's just the kind of tower that you normally wouldn't use, but it can go extremely fast, and I'd see that as more of a reason to use it than really anything else about it. Its weakness, of course, hidden enemies and bosses. Bosses are unfazed by its freeze, hidden enemies just run by it, so you better have some other defenses ready if you're using the Sledger. Accelerator, it's definitely the best at taking care of bosses. Its DPS is absolutely insane, but its ability to tear down those bosses is also kind of the reason for its worst attribute. That's it being able to deal with enemies alongside the bosses. Once the Accelerator locks onto the Fallen King, all the enemies nearby it are just free to run by, so it could be pretty risky using the Accelerator all by itself. And we finally have the Executioner. It's an absolutely legendary tower in terms of how much damage it could do to hordes. That would 100% have to be its upside, and it being amazing at dealing with hordes also kind of implies that it's trash at single target damage, which is exactly what it's worst at. The Executioner won't really dent that much health from a boss, so you're definitely going to want something else alongside it if you're using it. And just like that, those were all the towers I have. There are of course some other towers that exist in the game, like Swarmer, Frostblaster, Archer, ones that I don't have. So yeah, go check them out for yourselves if you're really curious, and thanks for watching this. Like, subscribe, StarCody, goodbye.